When discussing the complex relationship between science and Christianity, the first major conflict that occurs is between the concepts of evolution versus creationism. Evolution itself was first proposed by Charles Darwin in 1859 with his theory, the origins of species by means of natural selection. In this theory, Darwin states that all modern creatures are descendants of other creatures that had had positive mutations that allowed them to adapt to their current situation, thus called natural selection. An example of this could be seen when looking at the creatures of the Galapagos Islands. The pheasants and tortoises that lived on the islands all had slightly different mutations that allowed them to adapt to their specific island, which, even though they were all of the same origin species. Creationism is the idea that someone believes that God created both heaven and earth out of nothing in an act of free will. They also believe that with this, it took only 6 days to create the entire universe out of nothing. And they believe that the earth itself is only about 6,000 years old, following most of the origin stories of the Bible. And you can see that both creationism and evolution have very conflicting points of view in the ideas of how species and everything was created, and the length of which is very much conflicted. And this is very much shown in this next video that I'm going to have shown, which is Bill Nye the Science Guy versus Ken Ham, who is the president of the Answers in Genesis and the Creation Museum.
We're seeing people in being indoctrinated to believe that creationists can't be scientists. There's experimental or observational science, as we call it. That's using the scientific method, observation, measurement, experiment, testing. All scientists, whether creationists or evolutionists, actually have the same observational or experimental science.
Mr. Ham and his followers have this remarkable view of a worldwide flood that somehow influenced everything that we observe in nature. A 500-foot wooden boat, 8 zookeepers for 14,000 individual animals, every land plant in the world underwater for a full year. I ask us all, is that really reasonable? You'll hear a lot about the Grand Canyon, I imagine, also, which is a remarkable place, and it has fossils. And the fossils in the Grand Canyon are found in layers. There is not a single place in the Grand Canyon where the fossils of one type of animal cross over into the fossils of another. In other words, when there was a big flood on the earth, you would expect drowning animals to swim up to a higher level. Not any one of them did.
If Bill Nye and I went to the Grand Canyon, we could agree that that's a Coconino sandstone in the Hermit Shale, and there's the boundary. They're sitting one on top of the other. We could agree on that, but we would disagree on how long it took to get there. But see, none of us saw the sandstone or the shale being laid down. There's a supposed 10 million year gap there, but I don't see a gap, but that might be different to what Bill Nye would see. But see, there's a difference between what you actually observe directly and then your interpretation in regard to the past. We're talking about the past when we weren't there. We didn't see those tree rings actually forming. We didn't see those layers being laid down. It's like the dating methods. You're assuming things in regard to the past that aren't necessarily true.
The fundamental thing we disagree on, Mr. Ham, is this nature of what you can prove to yourself. When people make assumptions, they're making assumptions based on previous experience. They're not coming out of whole cloth. I encourage you to explain to us why we should accept your word for it, that natural law changed just 4,000 years ago, completely, and there's no record of it.
Natural law hasn't changed. As I talked about, I said we have the laws of logic, the uniformity of nature, and that only makes sense within a biblical worldview anyway, of a creator God who set up those laws, and that's why we can do good experimental science, because we assume those laws are true, and they'll be true tomorrow. We build models based upon the Bible, and those models are always subject to change. The fact of Noah's flood is not subject to change. The model of how the flood occurred is subject to change because we observe in the current world, and we're able to come up with maybe different ways this could have happened or that could have happened, and that's part of that scientific discovery. You cannot ever prove using the scientific method in the present, you can't prove the age of the Earth. So you can never prove it's old. So there is no hypothetical.
What we want in science, science as practiced out on the outside, is an ability to predict. We want to have a natural law that is so obvious and clear, so well understood, that we can make predictions about what will happen. And the big thing I want from you, Mr. Ham, is can you come up with something that you can predict? Do you have a creation model that predicts something that will happen in nature?
After watching the video, you can see that both these men are trying to use scientific principles to prove that their points of view are correct. Bill Nye is going on the idea of assumptions and the idea that carbon dating and stuff that is very hard to prove, whereas creationists kind of say, hey, we're trying to say there's no actual proof that you guys are correct on the actual ages. So it's the idea of making assumptions and not understanding everything completely, but trying to, where creationists is trying to make the assumption and fill in the blanks where science has its holes.
In this slide, we will be talking about cloning. We will discuss why cloning is important, why it's used, and how it relates to science and religion. So first off, we will explain what cloning is. Cloning is the process of artificially producing a genetically identical copy of a cell or an organism. The first people to do this were Scottish researchers. They've performed this experiment on a sheep. They named it Dolly the sheep. If you take a look at the diagram here, you will see exactly how they were able to do this. First off, they took the nucleus of the desired sheep. They fused it with another egg cell from another sheep. Eventually, they fused together, and then they were able to go on, reproduce, and create an exact copy of the sheep before it. Cloning can be used in many ways. It doesn't have to be just replicating organisms. Let's look at farmers, for example, and why they might use cloning. As you may know, it's not always the easiest to grow crops based on environmental or other factors. For example, if you have some crops that aren't doing too well during the summer, but some are, you can take the ones that are doing well, clone them, and increase the production. This way you can have very well-grown crops during the summer. Now I will discuss why cloning is important and how it relates to religion and science. First off, we have to look at why Christianity argues against cloning. One of their arguments is natural versus artificial. They believe that by cloning someone, you're taking away God's unique creation that has made that person who they are and is specific to them. So if you go off and clone someone and make an exact replica, what is the point in the Christian's eyes? Why did God make them in the first place? It takes away the values that God and other people believe in, Christians more specifically. Another argument that they might make is, do these clones have souls? Yes, they might go on to be real living people, but they're a clone of another person, and they may be living the same way the other person lived. Same eye color, same hair, be the same person. So do these people have souls? As you can see, these ideas kind of conflict with each other, which is why Christians don't believe it to be entirely ethical. They don't exactly know what God would say about this, which is why they provide the arguments they do. Another argument that they might make is that it's similar to abortion. How so, you might ask? Well, if you look at what abortion is, you're taking something, a baby, an organism that isn't born yet, and you're killing it before it could even have a chance at life. Essentially, what cloning is doing is you're taking the best traits from someone and replicating them. God creates everyone to be unique and stand out from each other, even if that means they have bad traits. So essentially, if you're taking only the good traits, you're taking away God's creation and what makes everyone unique. That is the way Christians look at it, and that is why they don't believe that this is the best way scientists could be using their technology and advancement. Christians obviously believe that God is the only creator of heaven and earth. And essentially, if you're cloning something and playing at God, making life, they don't believe this to be ethical. Like I mentioned before, where does the line get drawn? Who is the ultimate creator, scientist or God?
All right, so universe in Christianity, we're going to start with a quote. Two possibilities exist. Either we alone in the universe or we are not. Both are equally terrifying. It's by Arthur C. Clarke, the man who wrote 2001: A Space Odyssey. I feel like that really encapsulates the, if there is a God and he is out there creating other life forms, that's either scary because we haven't found them yet or scary because there aren't any. And then firstly, importance of the early church involvement with astronomy. The early church and scientists of that era, think 1500s, were almost obsessed with the heavens and studying the stars and the movements of the heavens. And so they often funded scientists. Galileo's a good example to, research more into the science behind the heavens. Secondly, the Big Bang Theory does not conflict with the Catholic concept of creation. The Big Bang Theory was actually theorized by a Catholic priest, Lemaitre. My French isn't as good as it should be, but try to bear with me on that. The Catholic priest invented the theory. He took some of Einstein's ideas about relativity and applied them to the universe, and what the church has declared is that the Big Bang Theory is maybe not evidence, but it is the work of God, and that is his awesome power that he can create the universe from nothing, since there isn't a finite reason as to why the Big Bang happened. And then in the American press, religion and space exploration. There was a Russian cosmonaut who went to space, and in the times of the Soviet Union, the whole country was mandated to be atheist. And although that sounds like a bad thing, it was the quote, just to sum it up, was that, the men and the scientists of Russia have made this great achievement of going to space. And he said, the cosmonaut said when he was up there, I didn't see a God, I didn't see angels. There's only people who made this come true. And the American press, who often use religion to combat communism of the Soviets, ridiculed him for this, and kind of spun it out of his favor, and this is so awesome because there is a God, not because the men and the scientists of Russia have enabled this to happen. So I thought that was an interesting dichotomy between the two countries. Next slide. Impacts of scientific discoveries. First and foremost, Gregor Mendel was a Augustinian friar, and he discovered genetics at his monastery by breeding pea plants, and saw kind of dominant and recessive genes within the pea plants. And then going back to the previous slide, the church funded astronomy for holidays because as the early church was trying to separate itself from other religions, it needed to have Easter at a different time than Passover. So they basically contracted Jesuit scientists to study the heavens and create a new calendar, which this video, pardon the inappropriateness of it being a Joe Rogan interview, but Neil deGrasse Tyson does recollect the events in a very articulate and thoughtful manner. He does a much better job of it than I could, and the video starts at 4:10, and I recommend you watch through the whole thing to really understand the full kind of concept of how the Jesuits studied the heavens and reinvented the calendar in order to kind of separate Catholicism at that time. Secondly is, or thirdly rather, the rejection of Darwin's evolution and natural selection. This is where Christianity, it's really important that it divides from Catholicism and Protestantism. The Protestants are much more literal in the fact that Darwin's theory basically means that man evolved from primates doesn't really fly with the Protestants, whereas the Catholics, going back to kind of the same concept of the Big Bang, is that, the man is only a vessel for the soul God has put in them. So in whatever methods we got to man doesn't really matter to the Catholics, because God's going to put this, he's going to create the soul that goes in that vessel for carrying his, his belief. So the Catholics have kind of accepted it, while the Protestants have fiercely rejected it. Moving into philosophical sciences, Aquinas' proofs, excuse me for forgetting the date, but he wrote 5 proofs in kind of like a mathematical deductive reasoning manner in order to basically convince the general population that God exists. They are an interesting read if you have the time. And then the importance of Jesuits throughout history, I briefly touched on that with funding astronomy, but they have made significant contributions to areas such as science and math throughout, especially the early part of the church's history. And then next slide, school systems on science versus religion. Just real quick, the most notable is the Scopes monkey trial. There was a man whose last name was Scopes, who was trying to teach evolution in the state of Tennessee, and not too long ago, in 1925, only 100 years ago, I guess, but that's still, it seems recent. And the state of Tennessee took him to court for trying to teach evolution. The law was that you can only teach that, God was the divine creator and that all men come from God. And so that's a pretty famous court case. And then secondly, you see a lot of religious tones and activism, especially from the religious right and the teaching of sex ed in public schools. The one statistic that really stood out to me was that 37 states require abstinence be taught, and 26 of them, so half the country, requires it to be promoted as the primary form of birth control, which isn't exactly practical. And that really stems from religion in a way that it kind of seeps into the public school system.
One of the many ways we can see religion and science clashing in popular culture is seen in celebrities. One, seen in one of the earlier slides, is Bill Nye of the childhood education show called Bill Nye the Science Guy. As a man beloved by many nostalgic adults and some teenagers, what he said in this TV show special called Uncensored Science, Bill Nye Debates Ken Ham, may have had a bigger impact on millennials and baby boomers. Not only that, but it's also because he is a bigger celebrity, even though he is a scientist, than Ken Ham, a Christian fundamentalist, young earth creationist, and apologist. And it's not saying that Ken Ham is not well known, but Bill Nye is better known in popular culture. TV shows and media sites are also portraying many different views. A show on Netflix called The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina has an episode called Chapter 19, The Mandrake, where they play around with cloning. In this episode, the clone is more or less a soulless killer because it has no soul, as the clone came from a plant called the mandrake. Here, magic can be seen as a parallel to science. In almost every movie, the clone has no soul and becomes dangerous. The religious belief against cloning is seen a lot through popular culture in movies and TV shows as well. Lastly, religion and science and its impact on politics has always been an ongoing debate. There is two huge roles in politics, those of liberals and those of conservatives. Those that are conservatives are usually known to be opposed to science, and people tend to think that it has to do with the fact that its demographics show that conservative parties contain mostly people of faith, aka Catholic, Christian, Protestant, and evangelical. And although liberals also contain people of faith, the faith seems to be more mixed, and the party is known to be more open and accepting about ideals. As a result, it is assumed that those a part of conservative parties will most likely oppose ideas about evolution, cloning, the Big Bang Theory, and are the ones that most likely want those teachings of science kept from children in schools. As a result, liberals fight back.
Media focuses on society's most negative interactions between religion and science. It doesn't portray the full picture of how science and religion interact in daily life. Popular culture sometimes fails to show society's diverse viewpoints towards the religion and science discussion. It would be more accurate if it portrayed the many instances where religion and science were opposing or were complementary. Ethics, research, philosophy, bioethics, politics, and many areas like work team diversity and social aspects are usually in some way impacted by the relationship between science and religion. There are some questions that may arise as a result of this topic. For example, where does Manhattan College lie? More on the spectrum of science versus religion? Does one side of the argument have to win, or can they permanently coexist? How will this play a role in politics in 10 years or 75 years?